Welcome to the Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgaway. And now your host, Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgaway.
Good evening and welcome to the Doctor's Corner on the CAW 360 Network. Again, I'm your host, Janelle Elgaway, and we are here with Dr. Kline. How are you tonight, Dr. Kline?
I'm just dandy.
Mm-hmm. To listen to tonight's show, you can go to our website, www.cawnatation.com or cawnation.com, and click on the listen button on the landing page. Or you can listen and chat live with our YouTube audience on the Doctor's Corner. If you have a question for Dr. Kline tonight, please call in to the studio line at 415-915-2291. So today was the North Carolina Don't Punish Pain rallies. I was in Charlotte and Dr. Kline was in Raleigh. How was the rally today how was the rally today in Raleigh?
Well, it was good. Some people with chronic pain were able to speak to the issues. They had coverage from Channel 17, CBS affiliate. So they did a story, and they also did a written story, and they did a story on the TV station that highlights the fact that pain patients are being injured as a result of the opioid hysteria. So.
Great. Okay. That was about the same with us. We had a reporter there. I believe she did a article on yourself and a chronic pain patient, Jessica Stewart. There's like 3 different ones in the Charlotte area. And it was really great. And it was so good to meet other chronic pain patients because it's so rare that you actually get to meet one another. So thank you everyone for showing up and helping spread awareness and putting yourself out there like that. So I would like to know, has there been any major topics in the news in the last 2 weeks that you wanted to go over with?
There's one interesting topic that I got from my medical journal that I read frequently called People magazine. Mm-hmm. And in People magazine, they had a feature story on Jamie Lee Curtis and her addiction. Now, I'm always suspicious when I read stories about addiction because a lot of them are type 1 addiction. They were on cocaine and they were on marijuana. And it's not very often that you get what might be a real type 2 opiate receptor addiction. But listen to her story. She was 31 years old when she went for some minor surgery and had opiates for the first time.
Wow.
She remembers the feeling of the pills washing over her, and she is quoted as saying, "This is crazy great. It is amazing." She chased that feeling for years and ended up like a lot of folks with type 2 opiate addictions, conning people. But she maintained her addiction with Vicodin. So she is truly one of the rare. Now, most people have a positive family history. So lo and behold, the article says her father abused alcohol, cocaine, and heroin. See, alcohol and cocaine can be a type 1, but heroin is a type 2. Her half-brother, Nicholas, died from a heroin overdose. So she's got it in her family. She never had an opiate. And so this is the setup for triggering the addiction. It doesn't say that she took these pills for months and months. It says immediately, this is crazy great. So right with the first pills, and every single person with addiction disease that I'm talking to reports exactly the same thing. It's very important that people realize that you can trigger this addiction if you have the genes, and you can trigger it with 1 or 2 pills. Having said that, you see the whole argument about exposure to opiates. That's what's behind all of the restrictions. We're trying to reduce the exposure because then people will become addicted. Now, we just heard a story, from a famous actress telling the story of really what it's like, and realizing that 99.5% of people who would have taken the same Vicodin will not get addicted and never will. And that kind of brings us to the story of the MME. Do you have some notes on that, Janelle?
Yeah, well, and that's what we're going to be, our topic is for tonight, MMEs and titration. MMEs is morphine milligram equivalent. What does this mean exactly when you're talking about this with a drug?
One of the things that doctors make a mistake about, and the general public makes a mistake, are milligrams. So in other words, if I give somebody an antibiotic and I tell them to take 5 milligrams twice a day of antibiotic X, they think they're getting a weak antibiotic. Well, what about that 100 milligram antibiotic? The milligrams are based on the atomic weight. So the milligrams are really just a chemical property of how heavy the material is, how many atoms are in it. So the milligrams themselves are only useful for one thing. That's comparing its own dosage. So if I have a patient on 5 milligrams of antibiotics and they're not responding, then I'll say, we'll give you 10 milligrams of that antibiotic. I don't say, I'll give you 10 milligrams of antibiotic B because it's too weak. So because different opiates have different atomic weights, then they will have different milligrams. For example, oxycodone has 30 milligrams, but other drugs like Hysingla will have 1,200 milligrams. So you have to get away from the milligram phobia, that the milligrams imply that one is different than the other. You hear this all the time with highly addictive opiates, powerful opiates. This is not true, because what we've done with the morphine milligram equivalents is we've tried to say, okay, if you give 100 milligrams of morphine, how many milligrams would you have to give of oxycodone to be the same potency? And you would give less oxycodone because it's, quote, more powerful. But once you have everybody equilibrated, they're all the same. So there's no such thing as a more powerful opiate.
So who created these charts? And
it was created by a fellow many years ago. A lot of it is done in animals. It's very inaccurate. A heroin tablet, believe it or not, has the same MME, morphine milliequivalents, as does oxycodone. So heroin in pill form is not more powerful than oxycodone or Percocet, because you've equilibrated it.
What does that mean?
Okay, so 1 milligram of morphine equals 1.5 milligrams of oxycodone. It's a 1.5 ratio. So if you're taking 100 milligrams of morphine, then your MME is 100 milligrams. If you're taking 100 milligrams of oxycodone, it's 150 milligram equivalent. So if you backed it down and you took, let's say, 75 milligrams of oxycodone, it would be the same as 100 milligrams of morphine. So now the two are the same. In other words, their potency is the same. In terms of real potency, does one opiate, is it more powerful for the same number of milligrams? I know this sounds confusing, but the thing to remember is an opiate is an opiate. Okay, people go out and they shoot IV heroin when they have an addiction. Jamie Lee Curtis just took Vicodin pills. And so did Dr. Grinspoon in the book Free Refills. A doctor who was hooked like she was just took Vicodin. So an opiate is an opiate. If addicts in the street were able to steal Vicodin, they would at least know how many milligrams were in it, and they probably would not die of an overdose. The reason that people have always used heroin is because it's cheaper.
Right. Mm-hmm. Can people metabolize different medications differently, even though they are both, the same narcotic, like in the narcotic family?
Yeah, that's a very good point. In other words, if I was taking 100 milligrams of morphine and I wanted to switch over to oxycodone, I would use those little graphs, and it would give me a rough idea how many milligrams to take of oxycodone. But that's only for me. If you are another person, your metabolism is totally different. So now you're getting down to how many morphine milliequivalents, MME, do you need to kill your pain? This is when things fell off the edge of the earth, because the anti-opioid forces that wrote the CDC guidelines began to say, wait a minute, 90 MME, morphine milliequivalents, should be the most anybody takes. That is flying in the face of medical practice and science, because virtually all the experts realize there's a huge variation. I can take 100 milligrams of morphine, but someone else might need 600, or they might need 20. So by trying to set a limit for every single person is a huge logical fallacy.
Yeah. Well, and we're each different, you know.
Yeah, it'd be like
put everybody in a box.
Put everybody in a box, like their bodies are all the same. And one thing about opiates is there's an enormous difference between patients. It'd be the same as insulin. I say, okay, nobody gets more than 50 units of insulin. Whoa. Some people get by with 10, some get by with 200. You know, because both drugs don't have any toxicity, any systemic toxicity, that means you basically take, if your body can tolerate it, you could take 1,000 milligrams of morphine and it wouldn't hurt your body. It wouldn't hurt your liver, your kidneys, your heart, your blood pressure. That's what makes insulin and opiates unique, is that each person can take them to an effective level. So that brings us to titration. Now, titration is a chemical term from high school chemistry. And if you remember, those who paid attention in high school chemistry, most everybody did the experiment where they put baking soda in a beaker and they put vinegar and acid in a pipette, which is a little tube that drops out, a drop at a time, the vinegar. And pretty soon you're going to neutralize the base. How do you know? You put in a little chemical, it's called an indicator. The base is blue, the acid is pink. You keep dropping in the acid until it turns pink. But the other facet of titration just means to go slowly, one drop at a time. But the other facet is the last drop has a bigger impact as you get closer and closer to the end point. So that translates into people who, for their pain, they take 30 milligrams of oxycodone. That didn't work. They take 60 milligrams of oxycodone, a little better. And then they take 90 milligrams of oxycodone, and the last 30 was worth 20 times more. All of a sudden, you get to the point where, wow, this really is relieving the pain more than I expected from the increase. So that's the key about titration. The agency that is legally responsible for these rules is the FDA. And again, we need to ask doctors why they are not following the FDA guidelines, because there is no 90 milligram cutoff. There is no cutoff at all. Doctors are expected.
Well, why has the CDC and like Medicare and Medicaid set these daily limits for patients?
Fear of addiction phobia.
What are they saying though that they're trying to?
What
will that do?
Yeah, they're claiming they're going to cut down on the overdose deaths. The overdose deaths are people who die in the streets from their heroin addictions. They say it's opioid related. It's more accurate to say it's heroin related deaths, because heroin's an opioid.
Well, and yet they say that like within 5 days you could become addicted.
That's not according to Jamie Lee Curtis, and not according to you can't. It doesn't take 5 days. If they want to limit the prescription to 2 pills, it would still be a problem, because
but this is my sorry. My point is though is that if say like I'm taking something and I'm set at 90 MMEs, how, if I'm already taking it, how is that supposed to curb the overdose and addiction rate?
Okay, it's because of the CDC's data use disorder, DUD, not SUD, substance use disorder. This is data use disorder.
Okay.
And this is not just coming out of the sky. This is dishonesty on the part of the CDC. This is scientific malpractice. This is scientific dishonesty. The epidemic was an increase of 1 death in the heroin community per 10,000 people. And it jumped to, the next year, 1.1 death per 10,000. To call that an epidemic is gross malfeasance of office. This is a federal agency under the jurisdiction of the Congress. Congress needs to investigate and ask specific questions. Why did you declare an epidemic when there was only a tiny increase in overdose deaths? And why did you not disclose who was dying? You see, reporters.
Well, isn't it patients dying and people illegally using drugs?
No, the people dying are heroin addicts, and they become addicted, like Jamie Lee Curtis. And Jamie Lee, because she had the resources, was able to get Vicodin, although she stole a lot of it. She did not have to resort to the street. But people who don't have enough money, and you can't go to doctors, they go what they can afford. And what they can afford is heroin. It's always been cheaper. And they say, well, heroin addicts are stealing prescription drugs. Yeah, if they can get their hands on them. And when you look at it from a doctor standpoint, it's better that they're stealing something with milligrams on it than picking up some stuff in the street where they have no idea, what's in it. And that's why they're dying.
Right, and now I'm hearing that the illicit manufactured fentanyl is what is really out there. And I've heard, like, a few counties in Ohio, they can't find heroin, actually, but they could find a lot of manufactured fentanyl.
No, heroin's drying up because fentanyl is more powerful. In other words, less milligrams that you need. If they use the proper number of milligrams, they would get the same as they do with heroin. And remember, there's a 2% death rate, which is pretty bad amongst heroin addicts. But that's not everybody. 98% of people in the streets on heroin and fentanyl survive. And they survive because they are trying to replace a certain amount of the missing opioid from the brain. And they're overshooting because they're getting bad products. Whenever they do a study of type 2 opiate addicts that go and get their medicine, their methadone or their Suboxone, and actually they could get anything. Remember, an opiate's an opiate or an opioid's an opioid. They could really get anything. And every time they do a study, less deaths, less crime. It works, it works, it works. But we're not going to give dope to dope addicts. That's the problem.
Well, yes, they are, though, with Suboxone.
Yeah, but the problem is, I just talked to a pharmacist the other day up in Henderson. She said they only have a 20% medication-assisted treatment, MAT, in their county, and they need 80% more. And the funding is drying up, you see, because people get the money and then they run away with it. They get the federal money and then they have committees and they start paying consultants. And it never quite filters down to doctors actually prescribing this stuff. It's getting so bad that we need the public health service to send doctors into communities to treat people caught up in the pain refugee crisis. Interestingly, CDC is part of the public health service. People wear uniforms there.
Really?
Yeah, they get commissions. You know, there was a woman on the news the other day from the CDC. She was in her little public health outfit. She was a lieutenant commander. So there is a core. Go ahead.
Yeah. CGF on YouTube asks, why doesn't the FDA speak up?
Good question. Agencies don't like to step on the toes of other agencies, but now is the time, because a third agency, CMS, which is Medicare and Medicaid, has decided to follow the CDC guidelines, at which point the FDA now should have come in and said, no, you're not. We're the legal entity. What are you doing?
Well, and didn't the CDC guidelines overstep the FDA? I mean, they're not supposed to be making guidelines or rules. They're supposed to be doing research and statistics, aren't they?
Well, they have a job to do as described by Congress. This would be no different than the Agriculture Department coming up with safety rules for nuclear power plants. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, if they wanted to, they could publish voluntary guidelines, you know, because based on something that they've done. In other words, they're not, you know, it would be improper to do that. It was very improper for the CDC to do that. And they need to be dragged up before Congress again. They were under the gun of the House Oversight Committee, which is a very powerful committee that looks into things, because this is causing an enormous expenditure of money. People are getting these $1,000 injections. People are getting these implants of stimulators that cost $60,000 and only work 10 to 25% of the time. They're getting pumps that cost $2,000 a month to maintain and $30,000 to put in. They're going to physical therapists that charge $200 an hour. A prescription of oxycodone,
unnecessary surgery,
unnecessary. You see, the hugest misstep by CDC is declaring that opiates are no longer the drug of choice in pain. They are really out of line there. They have no business whatsoever taking over the practice of medicine, taking over the CDC, and even taking over NIH, and making a statement like it's no longer the drug of choice, and that we should do all these other things. Well, that single tenet or philosophy has caused the agony in 6 to 7 million people, and it has run up the cost. Nobody's studying this. You know, these pain clinics, there were no pain clinics.
And they complain about it. Why aren't they putting anything out there to study this? Because
fear of addiction phobia. We don't care how much money you're spending. You know, we spent $600 billion, $600 billion on attempting to control the amount of substance, and it's never worked. And what do we read? The DEA is cutting back on the manufacturing CMS, the kindly Medicare administration, wants to cut back on people's opiates. Because if you cut back, then there won't be any more addiction. This is so ignorant that I just find it so hard to believe that there are people, responsible people with PhDs and MDs going along with this. We already did a substance subtraction with prohibition. We tried to take the substance away, and what happened? Not only did it not work, but it created crime. And lo and behold, what do we have now? Crime.
And why wouldn't we look at the history? I mean, history repeats itself, right? We could learn from it.
Fear of addiction. Fear of addiction phobia. It's the only answer. I mean, you see, you can't logic with people. It's like going up to the pastor and say, "Pastor, I don't think there's a God." And you're not going to get too far with the pastor with that argument. It's the same thing. Opiophobes. It's the same thing. You go up to them and you say, "How come you do it? How come you don't? Why don't you?" Why? And their eyes just get heavy and they walk away, just like the pastor. So it's the pastor syndrome. If you really want to try to convince the pastor there's no God, which will be tricky, you would have to sit down with a round table, and you would have the pastor and his other pastor friends, and then you would have atheists, let's say, on this side, and then you would have a moderator, and the moderator would say, "Okay, let's start discussing. Pastor Jones, you present your position, and George over here, you present your position, and I will moderate." When people start to yell and scream, the moderator says, "No, we're not going to yell and scream, but ask questions back and forth until the truth comes out." We should be doing this. Legislatures should be taking some of the $5 billion that's being spent on the opioid crisis, pretty much the same as it's always been. We forget about the Reagan war on drugs, the Bush war on drugs, the Eisenhower war on drugs. They all did the same thing. Let's spend some money. It was on a TV show, Madam Secretary, and she had this great line. She said, when people start to say we got to do something, usually means they don't know what to do. And that's what's happening here. So, has
this, like the MMEs, has that ever occurred with any other drugs, or do they do anything like that with any other medications?
Equivalence. There is sort of an equivalence with antibiotics. You can draw a blood level and make sure you got enough antibiotics in your bloodstream to kill the bacteria. It's called a minimal inhibitory concentration in MIC. And that's sort of a way with antibiotics. It might be 100 milligrams of antibiotics X, and it might be 1,000 milligrams of antibiotic Y, but they both have the same serum killing levels. So it's not as formal as the MME. And the MME is a very dangerous system. Now, here's something interesting. The CDC, in its infinite wisdom about medicine, and there's really nobody at the CDC that's had a lot of clinical experience, nobody, certainly nobody that wrote the guidelines, is they say, okay, if you have 200 MME, milliequivalents, so it doesn't matter what drug you're taking, you just got this 200 number. If you're going to switch to another drug, be careful and drop it in half. So when you're switching to another drug, you start with 200 that you're taking, and you're going to have a new one. You start with 100 MME on the new drug. So right away, the CDC is telling you this is an unstable number. And the reason they're saying that is because your body has gotten used to drug A, tolerance, a bad word, wearing off is a better word. Your drug has wearing off. It's getting a little less effective. And so when you switch to a brand new drug that you haven't become used to, you got to be careful because if you switch straight over, you're going to give too much. So the rule is, if you do the FDA titration, you start with a teeny weeny dose, and it doesn't work, you double it. It doesn't work, you double it. And you can do this in 2 days, where every 4 hours, double, double, double. Or you can just go up slowly. You can start with oxycodone. You can start with a half a tablet, 15 milligrams. It doesn't work in an hour, give 30. An hour later, give another 15. Slowly creep up on your titration until it works, no matter what the milligrams are. So,
how is this when you talk about instant release and extended releases, and also get it in IV? How does all of those come together?
Well, it gets more complicated with the MME, and that's why the MME is really a dumb system. And really, if you are using FDA guidelines, which says you can use any opiate to any level that works, the whole MME system is unnecessary, and it's misleading, and people love numbers. I cannot believe that the Medicare administration is going to try to use the 90 milligram number. I mean, there's no support for it. The CDC said it's a low scientific quality basis, and you know what? There's no category lower than low. It's the bottom. It means there is no scientific evidence. It's just evidence of their experts. And if you look at the list of experts, half of them were from PROP, the Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing, that have been described by an FDA official as lunatic fringe. And we've said this before. They are definitely outside the mainstream. These are doctors that believe pain medicine doesn't work. We've had 50 centuries of it working. So who are they? And who's paying them to say this? And who's paying them to put this stuff into an official CDC document? It was Thomas Frieden, who was the director of the CDC at the time, who said in public, pain pills are nothing more than heroin pills. He and the PROP president said the same thing. The head of the CDC, who's in charge of infectious disease, said pain pills are no different than heroin pills. Thomas Frieden, MD. So
love it on YouTube as who does the CDC answer to?
The CDC answers to the Deputy Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. HHS, I guess. I guess they've changed the name 16 times. So they actually answer to a deputy chief. But they're part of the public health service. It's all kind of murky.
Yeah. Ms. Harris from YouTube asked, if you have palliative care, can you pay extra money for your meds over 90 MMEs on Medicare, or is PC exempt financially for over 90 MME?
That's tricky because there's a difference between somebody saying, I'm not going to pay for it, and a pharmacist saying, I'm not going to give it to you. You see, CMS, Medicare, Medicaid, and insurance companies only say they're not going to pay for it. Now, if the pharmacist is willing to give it to you, and good pharmacists will, then you got to pay for it. So the answer is yes. And this is why I prefer to start prescribing with medicines that are cheap. Cheap medicines are plain oxycodone, long-acting morphine, and hydromorphone, which is dilaudid. Now, dilaudid kind of has a bad reputation, and it shouldn't, because more powerful. No, it's not more powerful. Not if you take the right amount. You just take less. If you want to make Vicodin more powerful, you take 10 of them. So the whole thing is a morass, really, of lack of reason and lack of critical thinking, and especially lack of scientific process. So,
people are asking on YouTube, if you get a pain pump, do they do MMEs with that?
No, you can't. It's too tricky because they're pouring the morphine directly into your spine into your bloodstream. So, and you know what? Everybody that I've talked to with a pump, they've underdosed them. Same problem.
Well, I've heard a lot of bad things about that. Like, I mean, I heard, like, especially the patients that get them, and then doctors, they move, or, you know, the doctors say you have to go find another doctor or something. And then when they do, many doctors will not take them on if they have a pain pump in them, or they ask them that they want to take it out and put in their own pain pump.
Yeah, that's this is called healthcare profiteering. Profiteering occurs when hustlers get in there and try to make a lot of money in a bad situation. The classic profiteering was during wartime. Because we're in a war and people need things, all of a sudden prices start shooting up for everything. And Harry Truman, believe it or not, when he was in the Senate, was in charge of monitoring profiteering during the Second World War and did a very good job of it. So now we have healthcare profiteering, where people are taking advantage and saying, well, you know, before I give you these medicines, you need to try this pain pump. My advice is, unless you have had a fully titrated trial by FDA regulations of oral medicines, nobody should even consider getting something stuck in your body. These things get infected. They have all kinds of problems. Now, I'll probably get a letter tomorrow from the interventionalists who stick these things in people's bodies and who do stick needles with steroids in them in people's bodies. Those are only to be done if the primary treatment fails. Now you can see what the problem of CDC saying drugs are no longer the primary treatment for pain. So what they're saying is the primary treatment for pain are stimulators, pumps, injections, physical therapy. Those should be tried first. This is a matter for the Inspector General. This is very near fraudulent, because you can see what they're doing is they're saying you're not going to get $60 a month worth of oxycodone. You're going to get $6,000 a month to take care of your pain pump. And all those people making money on pain pumps are just going crazy because the CDC gave them license by making the statement, and you can read it anywhere in the CDC guidelines, opiates should only be a last resort. That's wrong. It is still the drug of choice, and it's been that way for 5,000 years, and it's been that way in this country for hundreds of years. Who are these people?
Right. Most of us, though, had to go through all that to, you know, get pain medication. You know, we had to go through all that stuff. So that's why a lot of people are scratching their heads here and saying, what else do they expect us to do?
Well, this is the problem. This is what healthcare profiteering is. Profiteering is when there's no other alternative. You see, the government comes as yeah, it's a monopoly. In other words, the government comes to somebody who's making a critical element to build rockets, and the person says, "Oh, it's $1 million an ounce." Well, the government says, "No, you're profiteering, and we're not going to allow that. But we're going to give you a good price, but we're not going to let you go crazy." So all the profiteers, the interventionalists, anesthesiologists, who are poking needles in people and causing them to get adhesive arachnoiditis, are doing so under the license of the CDC, allowing them to do it by announcing that pain medicine is so dangerous and we're so afraid of it, you need to go do these other things that are far more dangerous, don't work.
How come the pharmaceutical companies have stayed so quiet? Because they have to be taking a huge hit in profits for them, correct?
Well, the drug companies have always made profits, and they've always been hustlers, and that's because they're allowed to do that by the government. Medicare has a rule they cannot competitively bid for medicine. How about that?
Oh,
how'd they get that done? You see, this is why buying drugs in Canada is better, because, and I know people in my family that have purchased medicines in Canada. It's the exact same pill, exact same bottle for half the price. They're getting away with murder, but the drug companies, I really am not blaming. They are really not involved with this. This is the CDC making, trying to make a 180-degree turn in medical practice, and they have no standing to be doing that any more than.
Go ahead. Are they doing what they did basically to the tobacco companies, except when they marketed tobacco, when they were doing the marketing? I mean, they were found that they were liable, and they did it incorrectly, and they said that it wasn't as addictive when it was. Aren't they doing the same thing with pain medication now with the pharma companies?
Not really. Do you know that Purdue, that makes OxyContin and charges $1,000 a month for it, which is the long-acting oxycodone, $1,000 a month. Anyway, so that people don't have to take it every 4 hours. So you want to take it every 4 hours, or $60. You want to take it every 8 hours, $1,000. Purdue, I just found out, part of the reason they agreed to settle for $600 million, they were accused of telling doctors that the drug was not addictive. That's not quite right. Purdue told doctors that addiction was rare, less than 1%. And they got nailed. And guess what? Purdue was correct. Purdue was correct. Opiate addiction is less than 1%. And there's some very nice references. If anybody wants to read it, just Google medium rare, like a medium rare steak, medium rare Kline, Kline, and it'll get you the article on my Medium about is it rare or not, and there's plenty of good references to show that it's rare. As far as my research so far has showed, I'm 98% positive that addiction, opiate addiction, type 2 addiction, is rare, less than 1%. So what are we doing? Restricting it and everybody else, But nobody wants to hear this. It's the pastor syndrome, Pastor, we don't think there's a God.
Why are they also wanting to stop producing oxycodone 30 milligrams?
I don't know. They should be producing 60 milligrams, but the federal police department actually is in charge of all this. So I have no idea what they're up to. But they're cutting back, and of course that's going to raise prices. And the same thing will happen. It happened in 1915 when they passed the Harrison Act and taxed opiates, effectively raising the price.
Right.
People couldn't afford it anymore, and that's when the heroin epidemic started in 1915, as a result of attempting to reduce the supply, which of course increases the price, as any kid in the 6th grade knows. In their economics class, increased demand, guess what? Up goes the price. So people were able to.
Isn't this going to cause a crisis also with the supply? Like they're already having supply issues right now, and more demand than supply. Like
there are some hospitals that are worried they're not going to have any narcotics at the end of the year. None.
Right.
But since none of the doctors are prescribing them anyway, what the heck? We might as well go back to the Middle Ages and alchemy, and just to give people garlic bags to put around their neck, or people are actually being sent to thoughtfulness treatment, where
I heard.
Where with thought you're going to get rid of your pain. These people need to have their shoulders dislocated. When somebody grab their shoulder and dislocate it and say, "Now we're going to have this thoughtfulness class," and that's $100 obsession,
Oh, I know. I had a girlfriend, her pain management doctor asked if they could pray together during her
Lordy.
treatment. Yeah, and she wasn't, she believes in God, but she just doesn't believe that's the place for it,
Well, you know what? These are called alternate treatments. And as a doctor, I start with the primary treatment, which is pain pills. Now, once you've got the pain pills going, you can try other things. You can try prayer, Tai Chi, but you've got the primary treatment going first. See, that's the key. I have a patient with horrible interstitial cystitis. She's had it for decades. And she went to a prayer meeting, and it went away for 9 years. So what the heck, give it a try, but not
Absolutely.
as the primary treatment, not as a primary treatment. This is an add-on or extra treatment, and if it works, nobody's going to argue. You can stop taking your pain pills, but at least you got your pain pills going and effectively, controlling their disease. I have, in 43 years, I have never had a patient addict. I have never had a patient overdose. And I've only had 1 or 2 patients who have failed to reach the point of pain control with an adequate dose. It's real simple. And there are people out there who are doing grave harm to 6 million people in the United States. That's 200,000 in North Carolina. Grave mistake. A mistake that should be held accountable. Where is the legal system? So,
I have a question about titration. You do titration when you're going on something. Is when you're going off pain medicine or stepping down, is that the same word? Is it titration to go down to?
No, it's funny. No titration, it's just up. If you're coming down, you taper off. But it's the same idea. You just go slowly. CDC, by the way, says tapering should occur at 10% increments. Like weekly should be done over 10 weeks. And nobody's even following that. You know what?
Yeah.
All these people that have accepted the CDC guidelines, I can tell you that they haven't read them, because I've read them and it took me weeks to read them and take notes.
And they're not really even talking about people with intractable pain or palliative care. These are supposed to be for primary care doctors treating acute issues.
Well, and chronic issues too, but for primary care doctors. Yeah. Supposedly, the pain clinics don't fall under these guidelines. More problems with the way the guidelines are written. And also, by writing the guidelines for primary care doctors, saying that you should be cautious and safe is telling primary care doctors, you're doing this wrong and you're causing this epidemic. So here's how you prescribe safely. And what is safe prescribing? I've always safely prescribed everything, which is you give the proper dose, you let people know what the side effects are, you might look it up in a book and go over it with them, blah, blah, blah. That's safe prescribing. What is safe prescribing for opiates? Do you know what it is? It's not giving enough. Because if you don't give enough, then you're not going to become addicted and become a dope fiend. I think it's more punishment than it is medical practice. Because
have they done any research on this at all?
No. See, they're not doing research on any of the key issues. The agency, we have a substance abuse agency that gets $4 billion a year. Substance abuse agency, right? And I read all the money they're spending and everything, and all they do is they go out. How many people smoke marijuana between 16 and 18 who are Hispanic? This is how they spend their money. And they have a lot of information and referral things that are all based on the wrong data. The thing is, you really got to separate the two kinds of addiction, because type 1 addiction really does need therapy. Most people are taking medicines to feel better because they feel horrible about themselves. So, that's kind of like a good situation for therapy. Type 2 addicts, heroin addicts, don't need therapy at all. They need to be given a controlled amount of replacement opioid, and I'll use the word opioid because it is a replacement amount of the chemical missing. I read yesterday something that I cannot believe, but it was written by somebody who is practically a Nobel Prize winner. Your brain makes morphine.
Right, I've heard that.
I always thought the endorphins and all that kind of stuff they're different, and they mostly are different. But can you imagine that the same substance that comes out of a plant, and then there's some little chemical stuff to turn it into morphine? Actually, your brain makes the same stuff this plant makes.
Amazing, isn't it? Right.
It's amazing, and it's wonderful. It's a gift from God. Speaking of God,
Yep.
you know,
how often does that happen?
how often does that happen? You know, what heavens?
Yeah.
And then for it to turn out to be one of the safest drugs we've ever had, and people really jump all over me when I say it's safe, and it is safe, and it's got a side effect or adverse effect, really, not a side effect, adverse effect of triggering addictions in 4 people per 1,000. But you know, Humira, which is the most widely sold drug in the world now for treatment of arthritis and stuff, there's about the same rate. It's a rare adverse effect where people die from having their immune system suppressed and die from it inducing cancer. Now, it's, you know, the company doesn't like people talking about it, and I'll say that it's rare side effect, but so is the side effect of addiction. I had somebody on Twitter say, so what? I'd much rather become addicted than have somebody deny me pain medicine. I can handle the addiction. The doctor can help me. You know, we can figure out a way to deal with an addiction. I'm not going to die from it if I'm with a doctor. You know, but Humira, you know, you suddenly get cancer, like your goose is cooked.
Are there any side effects like that from pain medication at all? Like
No, that's the stuff that oozes out of the poppy plant. It's just, to me as a physician, it's absolutely incredible. There are so few drugs that have no side effects. Insulin is one. Cromolyn, the stuff you spray up your nose, you know, when you have allergies, that has virtually no side effect. But you know, the list is very short. Now, we need more pharmacologists, by the way, in on this discussion, because that's what's missing. For example, what's the therapeutic index? What that is the distance between what you're taking where it works and the next level where you get toxic. With Tylenol, it's about 3,000 milligrams. So as long as you're under 3,000 milligrams, you're okay. Go over 3,000 milligrams, and you're liable to get kidney damage. And by the way, for people that have to take Tylenol, like with their Vicodin or with their Percocet, you can check your kidneys. You can get kidney tests, and if you're getting kidney damage, you just stop taking the Tylenol, and it'll reverse itself. So, but you know, it truly, from a pharmacological standpoint, maybe someday we can get a pharmacologist on here, and we can discuss these things.
Great.
But it's just to me, from a medical standpoint, it's just free of any problems. So you can, if you have to take it forever, you can safely. And the argument that we just heard from the prop member up in Canada is that, eventually the effects wear off. Well, they do have some wearing off, but it usually doesn't go to zero. And if it does, we do what's called rotation, switch to another drug. You know, if you're having problems with oxycodone or Percocet, then you could switch to Dilaudid. So it's really not a clinical problem, but they use that perversely to indicate that the drugs will stop working. So why take them? This is alchemy. This is medieval doctoring. This is going to the...
Is there also hyperalgesia or something like that too? Somebody was asking about that.
Say that again. Say again.
Is it called hyperalgesia?
Hyperalgesia. This is another myth that's running around, which is if you take the medicines, they're going to start to backfire, and it's going to cause more pain.
They cause more pain. Exactly. More pain. Yeah.
Okay. In 42 years, I've never seen anybody with this. I'm not too sure it exists, but for now, we'll just pretend that it does, and it's rare. But what it means is as you increase the dose of the medicine, your pain gets worse. So to diagnose it, you simply reduce the medicine dose, and the increased pain should improve. And if that's the case, you switch to another drug. You don't run around saying nobody should be taking this, because 1 in a million people get this hyperalgesia. And I don't know, not having seen it in 43 years, I suspect it's probably really rare. That is not a reason to say to everybody. That's kind of like saying, you know, antihistamines, there are some people that get real sleepy. So No more antihistamines. See how this is perverse. I have to use that word. This is perverse because
Well,
this
what I
is
didn't understand,
harming.
yeah, it's a humanitarian issue, and what I don't understand though is, they wanted to put these guidelines out there, and I feel like by fear of addiction, scaring everybody about certain things, about things that aren't truthful. People have really backed away from things. I lost my thought. I apologize. It was about
benzos, maybe about adding benzodiazepines.
Yes, that was part of it.
Okay, well, with benzodiazepines, they're wonderful adjuncts to opiates. Okay. We're doing a little study on the Twitter, and it looks like people really do benefit from taking both. They have a side effect because they both have sedation as a side effect. So you got to be careful when you put two drugs together that both cause sedation. You don't get too sedated. So you do it slowly, you titrate, you start with a little teeny weeny bit of Valium and you go up on the dose. And if there's no sedation, you're fine. You're out of the woods. So just go ahead and use it. But the perverse thinking is, wait a minute, if you just took a truckload of this stuff and a truckload of opiates, you might die. So we aren't going to give it to anybody. Well, nobody gets it. So right now, I just heard today, my doctor told me I had to stop my benzodiazepine that was helping with my back spasms. And a lot of people with pain do have terrible spasms as part of it. So my clinical experience over 4 decades has been this is a wonderful additive medicine, and it works very well, and I haven't had anybody overdose. So this fear of addiction, you see, is driving medical practice. The police are driving medical practice. Federal agencies are driving medical practice in spite of the fact there's a law that says the government cannot interfere in the practice of medicine. That's 40. If you want to look it up, it's 42 USC 1395. That's the law that says you can't interfere.
42 USC.
USC, which is United States Code. That means it's a law. So it's 42 USC 1395. And you can just Google it.
Yeah.
And it tells you that it's against the law for the federal government to interfere with the practice of medicine as it pertains to Medicare and Medicaid. This is part of the Social Security Act. So technically, but that's for everybody.
What I was going to mention, I forgot, was, they say that they gave alternatives, but there's really no alternatives that work if they take away pain medication.
Correct.
Are there?
Correct. Right. No, nothing else.
Why would they start putting out laws or guidelines and forcing people to do that when they have nothing to replace it with?
Fear of addiction phobia. In this country, an addict is the worst of all the criminals. Doctors are getting 60-year sentences for supposedly writing bad prescriptions. There was somebody arrested here in Raleigh for selling LSD, $1 million bond. They don't have $1 million bonds for murderers. In our culture, taking a substance that alters your thinking makes you immoral and dangerous. And it's unpredictable dangerousness. Because it's unpredictable, people are scared to death. And when they're scared to death, they develop a phobia. And when they have a phobia, they suspend all reason and rational thinking. And they run around trying to avoid this cloud of immorality and horror that might befall them or their families and turn them into dope fiends. Dope fiends. That's what the fear is.
We have a caller from area code 808. What's your name and what is your question for Dr. Kline?
Hi, this is Sharice. I called a few weeks ago, and I didn't get a chance to thank the two of you, by the way, so thank you for that. I called regarding the pump. But my question today is, if there's such a fear of addiction, is there a way that patients can be tested for the gene for addiction?
It's very close. There's two companies, commercial companies, that are going to test. Interestingly, there is a clinical way to test, and that is under supervised circumstance. Either you can have a few ounces of alcohol, or if you could get one Vicodin or two Vicodin tablets from your doctor, if you took them and you did not have a magical experience like Jamie Lee Curtis did, you're okay. But it would be a better way, it's a little cleaner and doesn't sound like I'm such a whack job, would be to get the test. They think it's going to be 80% effective. So there you still have kind of a little bit of a problem. The thing is to watch out for the reactions. Doctors need to tell people, have you ever had a Vicodin tablet before? They should have done that with Jamie Lee Curtis. And if you say no, they say, okay, be on guard. If you suddenly go to the moon and you have this unbelievable reaction, and what did she say? She put it very nicely. This is crazy great. This is amazing. Well, people don't say that for most drugs. So if you're warned ahead of time, then you're going to have your a one-night stand, and you're going to have this great reaction to a couple of pills, and then you're going to stop, or you're going to take the medicine in a controlled fashion. And that's part of how you would treat a person with identified type 2 opiate addiction, and there are no treatments. Nobody's even thought of this. You see, because everybody's running around afraid of dope fiends, and they don't really sit down and say, like you would at a round table with a moderator, you could say, okay, so I warn everybody, and the poor kid who dies from heroin addiction, if you back the story up and the doctor says, you ever had an opiate before there, George? And the kid says, no, you say, okay, bring your parents in, everybody's got to be in on this. If you go to the moon, you got to let us know immediately, like you call me in the middle of the night, because you have potentially a fatal disease, and we're going to treat it. And if you did that, people would stop dying in the streets. They would stop becoming, a pain in the rear for society and stealing things, because you would treat them in a supervised and controlled fashion. You would do the opiate replacement by a doctor with a prescription, possibly in a 30-day rehab to get started to find out what works. And then the person is fine. They're going to take the opiate, and they would still have an option if they wanted to, like a lot of addicted people, type 2 addiction people do. They go clean. But I'm finding out that a lot of people are saying their lives are very empty. And I'm beginning to wonder whether we should be real free with offering the replacement therapy. And that's still not mandatory, but say, look, if you're really feeling horrible and empty, this is available to you. So if we did that, we wouldn't have any more stories in the newspaper. It's no different than the stories we had 30 years ago. Barbara Ann is dead. Oh, what happened to her? Well, she got pregnant and she went up to another state and had an illegal abortion, and now she's dead. Same parallel story. She's dead because of ignorance, because the school didn't want to teach anything about contraception, and they didn't want to have counseling when kids got pregnant. So off they went. This was a common thing when I was a young doctor. The high school students would disappear. Oh, where'd they go? Oh, they went to visit their aunt.
Right, I remember that.
They go off in this horrible shame, and then they would get an abortion, or they would have the baby and give it up for adoption, and nobody ever said, hey, you want to be a parent? Some of the best parents I ever had when I had my pediatric practice with teenagers. Amazing women.
Sharice, thanks for calling in. We're going to take one call before we get going here. Caller from area code 816. What is your name and what's your question for Dr. Kline? Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes. Hi. My question is in regards to what Dr. Kline's opinion is of doctors forcing patients to undergo epidural injections using corticosteroids that, of course, we know are not approved. And how do they get away with this? And how can patients get around this and still get treated, get their medication?
Okay, the thing to do is, if they say you need this before I'm going to give you your pain medicine, that's against the law. That's called extortion. Extortion is when you pay money to avoid something. So, in other words, they're saying, you get this, and then I'll give you your pill. So what you need to do is you need to write a letter to the board of registration in your state. Just Google board or medical board. You'll get there. And put in a complaint that my doctor told me that I had to have this dangerous injection with a lot of side effects before they would prescribe me pain medicine. That'll get the board's attention. That's against the law, and it is a serious, what I consider to be criminal act. So.
Well, Dr. Kline, we are going to wrap up here. Would you like to share anything else before we get going?
No, I think the last caller really it really hit home that this is an illegal activity on the part of pain clinics, profiteering and injuring people. There's a lot of side effects in these injections, and you just got to report them. I mean, they're all licensed in the state that they operate in. You got to report them, and the Board of Registration will investigate. And in egregious cases like that, and when you put in complaints, short bullet points, no emotional language, no accusing people. I went to this Dr. Jones. He said, blah, 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 and I have this disease. Always list your disease. Don't ever say you're just a chronic pain patient. List your disease. And it can be very, very brief. And you can write it ahead of time and then cut and paste it into the little window that they have at all the Board of Registration of Medicine websites for complaints. You just got to put in a lot of complaints. So.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kline, and thank you to the audience for taking time out of your evening to join us here. Appreciate it. And we will see you next Tuesday here at the Doctor's Corner. Have a great night, everyone.
Good night.
This has been The Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgoway. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved.